Hugh Despenser the Younger, remembered by chroniclers less for his noble blood than for his ruthless ambition, was born around 1286 into a family of modest aristocratic standing. His father, Hugh the Elder, had titles, but the Despensers were far from the great magnates of England. In another life, Hugh might have remained a figure on the margins of power, a man remembered only in dusty genealogies. But fate and his own calculating ambition placed him in the orbit of the crown. His fortunes transformed when he married Eleanor de Clare, granddaughter of King Edward I and niece to the reigning Edward II. This was no simple union of households. Eleanor was one of the wealthiest heiresses in England, and through her, Hugh was suddenly bound to royal blood, to power, and most dangerously to opportunity. In the chessboard of medieval politics, this marriage was no pawn's move. It was the hand of a man reaching for the crown itself, not to wear it, but to rule from behind it. By 1318, Hugh had secured the post of royal chamberlain, granting him daily access to Edward II. In medieval courts, proximity was power. The chamberlain did not simply guard the king's chambers, he oversaw the king's private business, finances, and intimate affairs. Hugh used this position with a predator's precision. To the barons, he appeared as a shadow behind the throne, whispering into Edward's ear while seizing lands and favours with both hands. It was in South Wales where his appetite for land became infamous. Hugh schemed to expand his holdings at the expense of the Marcher Lords, the rugged barons who had long defended and dominated the borderlands. To dispossess a Marcher Lord was no small theft. It was a declaration of war in a land where honour and survival intertwined. Chroniclers accused him of manipulating courts, forcing judgments, and using Edward's authority as a weapon against any rival. The Vita Edwardi Secundi, a near-contemporary record, observes bitterly that all men turned their hearts against him because of his pride and wrongdoing. This was not jealousy, it was terror. Nobles found themselves stripped of their lands by fabricated charges, their voices silenced by Hugh's influence. Men who had once stood equal with the king now faced ruin at the hands of a chamberlain. Edward II himself seemed unable or unwilling to resist. Some chroniclers even imply that his devotion to Hugh went beyond friendship, a bond that blurred the line between dependence and obsession. Whether or not this intimacy was romantic, the political truth was clear. The king's will was often indistinguishable from Hugh's ambition. By 1321, the kingdom had reached a breaking point. The barons, enraged by his unchecked greed, forced Edward to exile both Hugh and his father. For a moment, the realm exhaled in relief. Yet Hugh's exile was brief. Within a year, Edward recalled him, not merely restoring him, but unleashing him as an instrument of vengeance. The Despensers returned with fury, leading campaigns that punished their enemies with confiscations, executions, and humiliations. Hugh emerged not just as a royal favourite, but as the very embodiment of Edward's will. England groaned under his influence. To his enemies, he was no longer merely a greedy courtier, he was a tyrant in all but name, a man whose grasp stretched from the royal treasury to the fields of Wales. In these years, it was said that England was not ruled from the throne, but from Despenser's whisper. And whispers, once unchecked, grow louder, until they drown out the very voice of kings. By 1322, Hugh Despenser the Younger had ascended to a height few courtiers ever reached. Through Edward II's unwavering favour, he now controlled vast estates, titles, and the machinery of royal justice itself. He was the hand that signed decrees, the shadow behind judgments, the unseen master of confiscated wealth. In South Wales, his authority grew so absolute that he ruled almost as a king in miniature, enforcing harsh rule over Marcher Lords who once considered themselves Edward's equals. Chroniclers like Jean Lebel later remarked that Despenser acted as if he were king. But absolute power creates absolute enemies. With every land seized and every noble ruined, Hugh forged new grudges that would outlast mercy. England's nobility seethed with resentment, and his cruelty extended beyond barons into the lives of ordinary subjects, merchants taxed unfairly, towns stripped of privileges, widows left landless by his manipulations. It was as though the kingdom itself bent under his weight. His gravest mistake was believing that this power could shield him from consequence. In reality, it only drew together those who hated him. Among them was Queen Isabella of France, Edward II's estranged wife. Once a dutiful consort, Isabella had been humiliated, marginalized, and publicly dishonored by Despenser's influence. Even her own dower lands were seized under his schemes. To Isabella, Despenser was not merely an obstacle, he was the architect of her misery. She found an ally in Roger Mortimer, a powerful marcher lord who had once tasted Despenser's cruelty firsthand, imprisoned and stripped of influence. Together, Isabella and Mortimer formed one of the most dangerous alliances in medieval history. In 1325, Isabella travelled to France under the guise of diplomacy. In truth, she was plotting rebellion. She gathered supporters, secured her son's betrothal to the French royal family, and raised forces across the Channel. Her demand to Edward was simple and unyielding. Despenser must be removed from power. Edward refused. That refusal lit the fuse. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with a modest army, yet they were greeted not with resistance but with open gates. Nobles, clergy, and even townsfolk rallied to their cause. Decades of humiliation and abuse had primed the nation for revolt. Entire towns rose in support of the Queen. What had begun as an invasion swiftly became a wave of liberation. Edward and Hugh fled westward, seeking safety in Wales, where the Despenser's power had once been strongest. But loyalty is a fragile currency. Their supposed allies melted away, and betrayal followed them step for step. On the 16th of November 1326, near Lantrasant, Hugh was captured alongside the fugitive king. The man who had ruled England through fear now stood powerless, abandoned, and despised. The Queen and Mortimer understood that as long as Hugh Despenser lived, Edward's influence could rise again. But more than strategy demanded his death, it was vengeance. Nobles clamoured for blood. Commoners whispered eagerly of justice long denied. This was not to be exile, nor even a clean execution. It was to be a reckoning. A trial was convened, though trial is generous. The verdict was never in doubt. Hugh was accused of treason, theft, and tyranny, of corrupting the king and bringing ruin to the realm. His crimes were catalogued not for judgment, but for theatre. The sentence was crafted not merely to kill, but to obliterate him body, name, and memory. On the 24th of November 1326, in the market town of Hereford, the stage was set. A scaffold towered over the gathered crowd, the air electric with anticipation. Chroniclers record the jeers of townsfolk who had travelled miles to witness the destruction of the man they called the destroyer of the realm. Despenser was stripped of his garments and mocked with a crown of nettles, a cruel parody of the influence he had once held over Edward. He was dragged through the streets on a rough hurdle, his body jostled and cut, a punishment reserved for the worst traitors of England. What followed was among the harshest sentences known to English law: hanging, drawing, and quartering. He was first hanged by the neck, but cut down before death could claim him. Still conscious, he was bound to a ladder where his body was desecrated before the crowd in symbolic mutilation meant to purge his sins. His heart, the seat of loyalty, was cut out and cast into the flames before all. Only then was he beheaded and quartered. His remains became instruments of warning. His head was placed on London Bridge. His limbs were sent to York, Bristol, Dover, and Newcastle. Every display was a message. No subject, no matter how close to the king, could place himself above the realm. For Edward II, imprisoned and helpless, the execution of Hugh Despenser was not only the end of his closest ally, it was the death knell of his reign. Within a year, he would be forced to abdicate, replaced by his young son Edward III, while whispers spread that the deposed king himself later died under mysterious and violent circumstances. Hugh Despenser's end remains one of the most infamous punishments in English history, not merely for its brutality, but for what it represented. His death was a ritual erasure, a dismantling of tyranny performed before the eyes of a nation. History remembers him not as a king, nor even as a great lord, but as a warning that unchecked ambition, cloaked in the favor of the crown, can rise swiftly and fall even more violently. And in that fall, the cycle of vengeance that drives kingdoms forward is laid bare,